Thank you, William. Now for more analysis on the Ukraine crisis and its impact on the global economy, here's Lincoln Mitchell joining us live from New York City. He's Adjunct Associate Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. Lincoln, thank you very much for doing this. I've got a lot of work to get through here, so feel free to answer relatively briefly. I just want to sum up for our viewers around the world. It seems to me that there are three areas that these sanctions are focused on. The banks, two of them out of Moscow, one of which has $80 billion in assets and is known as the piggy bank for the Kremlin. Investments, the Russians can't get money out of the West anymore, they can't raise money from the West, and the oligarchs have been targeted personally. Is that a pretty fair summation in your view about what has been done on Tuesday?
Essentially, yes. And the important part of this is that these are sanctions that are aimed not at hurting the Russian people, not at making it harder for the Russian people to get the basics, but by hurting the oligarchs and the others around President Putin, including Putin himself, and hurting their access to the West, because they don't want to walk away from the West. They like their involvement with the West. They like the wealth, the opportunities the West offers them. So it's trying to cut them off, cut the leadership off, rather than really hurt the Russian people.
Well, that's very interesting. So do you think then that by targeting these oligarchs, they're really putting pressure on those people who have often more money than sense, I think, hoping that they will go to President Putin and say, what are you doing? You know, all our assets are frozen. You've got to stop this. Is that the idea?
That's the hope. It's also, the United States doesn't have a lot of cards to play here. Right. Biden has wisely said we're not going to be sending troops to Ukraine. There are opportunities to supply weapons to Ukraine and all of that, but this may be the best punch the United States has right now. I'm not convinced it will work, but you have to try it.
Well, that's the next question. I wanted to ask you that. Is this in total coordination with United States allies?
I would think so. I mean, Biden has throughout this process, negotiating this crisis or navigating this crisis with Russia and Ukraine, he has been working very closely with our allies in Europe and in NATO. So I would suspect, yes, one could suggest that he learned a lesson in Afghanistan. He's not going to make that mistake again.
But I want to ask you, this is not the swift and severe sanctions that were previously touted by the president, is it? This is something different, right?
Well, Biden, there are other levels of this. I may use the word swift, excuse the pun, but he could cut Russia off from the SWIFT network, which is how, and that would be pretty devastating for Russia. So that, I guess, is one more level to which he can go. But the question of whether sanctions are going to be enough, sanctions, my sense is that we have to, whether or not we like what Vladimir Putin is doing, we have to recognize he's not a dummy. And he knew this was coming. And he knew that if he did what he did yesterday with moving troops into Luhansk and Donetsk, with recognizing the so-called independence of those regions, there was going to be a strong response from the United States. So I don't think this is a surprise. I think he planned to take this hit, and he's going to take this hit.
Is there anything else that they could target that Russia really needs but cannot get anywhere else from these Western countries? I'm just off the top of my head thinking maybe microchips, for example.
I'm not 100% sure, but it is worth noting that, you talk about the Nord Stream pipeline. There are other ways that Russia gets its natural resources to the West.
Right.
And Russia needs a market, because if they can't sell it to the West, they're going to sell it to the East. And China will be able to buy it for dimes on the dollar, because they're no longer competing with anyone, because Russia needs to make some money. So the more you can cut off Russia as a market to sell their fossil fuels to the West, you can begin to hurt Russia, but that will, as you were talking about earlier, that will contribute to the problems we're having in the West with inflation and supply chains. So it's going to hit both sides.
And what is your opinion about the fact that they managed to get Scholz, the new German chancellor, to agree to suspend the certification of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? It's been built, but the certification is suspended. Now, this is something that Angela Merkel, of course, who's now gone, wouldn't countenance, would she? And Biden's got Scholz to do it.
Well, I don't know if it's permanent or not, but yes, for the moment he has. This suggests to me that Germany is concerned about Putin in a way and concerned about Russia in a way that was not true in the past. And if that is true, that is very bad news for Russia and very good news for the West. So this, the Nord Stream pipeline, that is a big deal. But what it symbolizes, one thing we should recognize here is that just as with his 2014 invasion of eastern Ukraine and Crimea, Putin really drew public opinion in Ukraine together against Russia. He's done the same thing now. Putin has done more to bring NATO together and get it on one page than anything an American president could have done.
Yes, and Lincoln, in 10 seconds, if you will, just 10 seconds we have left, there were sanctions levied against Moscow in 2014 after they went into Crimea. How did those sanctions fare, just briefly?
Well, they didn't do what they needed to do because they've been in Crimea and they've been in Luhansk and Donetsk and the Donbass region since then.
Lincoln Mitchell, we appreciate you. Thank you very much indeed. Lincoln Mitchell, Columbia University, New York. Now we're going for a short break.